Welcome to another Lumion live stream tutorial. This is Chris Welton from CweltonDesign, and this tutorial is all about a checklist we can use before we hit the big render button on the very end of our project, the final render button for the final project. Now, this is coming from 5 years of experience with me using Lumion and having to go through this process. And I've learned a lot, and I'm excited to share a good checklist of things that we should all be doing if we can, if possible, before we hit render on those really important deliverables, the final render times. So in our scenario here, we're going to work with a scenario. I have a project here. It's just about midnight, and I need to have a final render done by the morning, 8 a.m. So about 8 hours away. So we need to go through several steps to optimize our time window. So make sure we can render in that time amount what we need to sacrifice, what we need to cut, what we need to adjust to make that render time first, the best quality possible. Then when we also need to refine it, make sure we get to watch it something before we actually hit render to make sure everything's looking clean, layers are turned off, etc. We'll go over that. And also being able to check our lighting in different scenarios without having to actually render the entire thing out with full settings on. I'm going to show you guys an awesome shortcut that's going to give us full render quality, exact render settings that we're going to render at very quickly. Just good samples to understand our lighting and effects and how they're affecting our scene. And then a couple of little things that I've learned I'm going to tack on there as well. Step number 1, end a project, you've been working hard, save. Seems pretty straightforward at this point in any software we're working with. Save often, save now. And so remember, there's the big save here. You could also be hitting F5, which is quick save. Quick save saves a lot of time. It's not quite as... it doesn't take nearly as long. Sometimes my saves on my large projects take minutes. It's annoying. I don't like having to stop and then something happens. Quick saving has been pretty nice. I recommend that. And we do have the autosave recovery, but I would not depend on it. It's saved me many times, but it doesn't work every time. And it takes a long time to recover sometimes. So you don't want to be sitting there at midnight waiting for it to auto recover and hoping that it's recovered everything. That's not a good plan. So, step 1, save. Step 2, this is kind of, accepting our limitations. We want to render everything, of course, at 4K, 5-star, 60 frames per second if we could. But realistically, we don't have a week to render some of these projects. So what I'm going to do is I have my settings all turned on in here, and I'm going to try hitting the render button and seeing what it's going to quote us in the best possible scenario. Let's just do that, like I said, 5-star, 60 frames per second, 4K. Overkill, I understand. This is actually a pretty simple little project. It's not nearly as complex and heavy as some of the ones you'll be working with or that I typically work with. But it'll work for our example right here. Just the idea that we can hit the render button and just know we're not going to make it. If we need this done by 8 a.m. in 8 hours, we probably need max 7 hours of rendering. 20 hours is going to cut it. So I don't want to dive too much into this. It can get really complex. But this is the first step I want you guys thinking is understanding, say in this case, the client is requested 4K. There's going to be different projects where you have certain settings where you don't want to go less than 5-star because you have a lot of depth of field that affects it significantly, or you can't go less than 60 frames per second because you plan on going into post-production and getting it timed to music, and you need that flexibility. So every project's different. Just understand that we can cut certain things, and then we have more options after this. So Let's just say we go down to 30 frames per second, 4 stars, 4K. And let's see if this could realistically be done. Okay. It's always jumping around a little bit. I wouldn't rely perfectly on this, but it's always pretty decently accurate. We're kind of jumping around a little bit as we get more frames in. It starts to do a little bit better, but I would probably want to do is pad this back a little bit more. And I can show you guys there might be some other methods other than sacrificing our settings here. The next thing we could take a look at are our effects. An important part is understanding what are the heaviest effects in your scene and in Lumion in general. Typically, skylight and reflection are going to be the heaviest hitting. If you happen to be using GI, that's heavy as well. But reflection planes, that really kills it, and so can skylight. So in our scene here, I have 3 reflection planes set to all of the different scenes. Reflection planes might be something you're not willing to sacrifice, but understand that each one of these planes you add could add as much as 50% more render time. So let's just say we want only the glass, and we'll take off the floor here, and we'll just let Speed Ray take care of that. And skylights, it's set to normal. I've had to deal with this many times. I love skylight. I want it on all the time, but there's been many times I've had to sacrifice skylight. Maybe in certain scenarios I'm more willing to drop some of these settings to get skylight lighting looks in there, and sometimes I can't. I have it set to normal. That's about as high as you're going to get typically for animations, but say it was set to high, you could set it to normal. If you just can't get it down even more, then you might have to consider turning it off. Understanding sometimes this scenario happens where you just have to get it out as fast as possible. So maybe removing that one reflection plane might have done it. Another thing to take into account is that estimate is only pulling the first scene here. If our first scene here only has 3 reflection planes, or now 2, and then the second scene, or this scene over here, scene 6 has 10 reflection planes and skylight's set to high, this can't read that in the very beginning. And just understand that it's going to go that much through. That's going to be the frame rate through most of these, and this one will be a little longer. It's not rocket science, but just be cautious and err on the side of safety when you're trying to get you're trying to make it within a deliverable date that's really close. And really, I'm just trying to get you guys thinking of ways of trimming this down. But let's say we've got our settings all dialed in. This is what we know we want to do. The next thing we really want to try to do is render a 1-star pass. And what I mean by that is basically drop it as low as possible on settings just to get something rendered out. The quality is not going to be good. Your effects aren't going to look exactly the way you want to, but it's even more important. This is kind of looking at this overall of your animation, watching it, actually sitting down and seeing it. You may find many issues that you didn't see while just scrubbing through and jumping quickly through this real-time preview in here. Oftentimes, heavy projects might not be running in real time, so you can't even gauge how fast these scenes are going. So render a 1-star pass. If you're working in post-production, I recommend staying at the same resolution if possible, because then you can easily start editing your scene in post-production while it's rendering. You can edit the 1-star pass, and then when the final one's ready, you just hit the replace. That's really nice, but otherwise, do what you need to do to get it done quickly. You can even go down to 720. And still says it's going to take a couple minutes, 13 minutes. Maybe something we can do too, if you need to do this really fast, I know it's annoying, but we might have to just turn off reflections or a lot of these effects that might be contributing to render times. Mass move you don't want to turn off. It can be really heavy, but in this case we were trying to check for people walking if there's any errors. Okay, 2 minutes. We can wait for that. It's always worth it. Obviously the quality is not great. This is looking terrible, but even as it's rendering right here, because it's going so fast, this is a good chance to take a look at people placement. Do we have people walking through another? Do we have some weird shots? There's a shadow guy sitting in this car right here. Maybe we need to rethink of what's right there. Maybe we need to rethink of what's going on with these trains. Are the trains repeating? Or they look weird? That's stuff that we can be seeing as we're going. Something you might be checking for as well when this is done is people walking without a path, moonwalkers. They happen. Make sure all your layers are turned on correctly. That happens all the time to me where I have something and I've turned off a layer to make everything run quicker and I forget to turn it back on for the final render, or something's not set up. Check for flickering. And another thing too that we can't do until this is fully rendered out to watch is check for timing on your shots. Many times you'll render it out and it looks good in the preview, but when you start to watch it, the clip's just moving too fast. And so you just need to slow it down a little bit more. Obviously that's going to end, you got to balance it out. You got to balance the render time out. So adding more time adds more to renders, but these are decisions you're going to have to make and make sure this is looking as you expect. Something too is maybe you'll have a tree that comes into the frame or really fast or something's moving. Look at that. I just saw the train. I have it set to a mass move and it just appeared right there. By luck of the draw, maybe it could have been over here. That's something to play with. Keep an eye out. So the last thing you want to do is have everything rendered out beautifully, and then you just have these little things that just kind of ruin it. If this is your final render and you need it to be polished as good as possible, this is one of the biggest things I've learned is doing this 1-star pass and getting yourself to sit down and watch it, because it's not fun when you have to sit down and watch it after it's been rendering overnight and you don't have time to fix it. So we're going to pull that up really quick. I have that under here. So our test. Okay. So I know it's low resolution. 1080p honestly doesn't render that much slower than 720. So I'd probably stick with that. Again, we're watching for certain things that we might catch that we didn't see before. This flickering is a quality issue, a resolution issue. I wouldn't worry too much about that. That's actually pretty nice. I have the girl just walking right there looking around. It's supposed to be a shopping center. That clip's moving a little fast. I don't really quite like that. That might need to be adjusted. This is moving pretty nicely. I think she just walked through her. So, nitpicking here. I think that person's supposed to be moving, and they're not. Again, we get the trains going in here. And see, that's a little weird. The two men, they're walking right through the bike. Look at that. So, adjustments need to be made. Oh, she's pushing the shopping carts to them too. This happens all the time. At least we're checking it now. So, 1-star pass. It's worth it. That's one of the bigger things. Get your render time realistic. Do a 1-star pass. And here's another thing to help you with the fine-tuning of lighting and effects in the visuals. Obviously, we don't have time to render the whole thing out and watch it because it's going to take all night. The other option that I used to do is I used to do current shot sometimes to just test lighting and skylight. First, let's turn them back on. Reflection and skylight. Honestly, and skylight is the biggest focus in here too, because as of right now in Lumion 9, we've had skylight for a couple years. It's amazing, but we're not previewing it here, and so we have to just double check our lighting when we render it, because if you set this saturation value too high, everything turns way too blue. It can really mess up your coloring setting up in here. So one of the best ways to check for that one, as well as hyperlight, which you can't see right now, is by rendering out some frames. And current shot actually does not work really well, because current shot is transferring to the still rendering process that Lumion does, which is different, a little bit different than what is going to be happening when it renders an animation. Really nitpicking here, but I've learned that especially hyperlight is much different in stills versus animation. The other thing you could do is you could just say, I want to render this one frame right here, render frame 0, and check it. The best thing here though is this awesome keyframe section here. Let's make sure that I grab the entire render movie here. We can render keyframes, and we're going to render these at the quality we set, which was 4K 25 4-star. So what this is going to do, test lighting, is it's going to render all of the camera points that we've created, and a lot of these and these shots are just camera here, click, camera here, click. So it's going to render the first camera shot, then the last camera shot, then move to the next scene. If you have one where you're going click, 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 it's going to go to each one of those camera points. And guess what? We're at full quality here, and it says it's only going to take three minutes or so. Definitely worth it. Big time saver. I discovered this actually pretty recently, and it's a great way of checking all of our lighting. Everything's looking good in here. It's a little dark in there. I wasn't quite previewing that. Everything's looking pretty good right here. I'm going to take the time and not speed through this and really kind of walk through the process here. Because I set something in here that should be messed up. So again, this looks a little dark. It's kind of cool, but it might be a little darker for our taste. I can even preview some motion blur on that bird. So as we take a look at this, oh look, that car's off the ground just a little bit. That car's in the ground, it looks like. But as we take a look at this again, we're able to put a magnifying glass on everything to make sure we're really getting what we're expecting. Because sometimes we envision something and it just doesn't quite come out the way we want it to, or we were expecting it to. And again, if you don't need to do all of these, you could just do a single frame. See, definitely skylight is taking into effect in there, making a huge difference. See, maybe it's worth putting a reflection plane right here, because that's looking a little messy. So, got the sun in the shot. It's not too bad. Although this might be an instance where it might be a little blue. I set up one of the scenes. I set up one of the shots on purpose to be a little too saturated on the skylight. It actually worked out just fine. But I've had that happen many times where the skylight saturation really messed up the lighting in my shot, or at least it wasn't what I was expecting. And this is where you get to fine tune and preview it. You could essentially drop the render quality settings a little bit too, to still get an idea of the lighting. But there's another step to add into here. Okay, so those are the main steps. Save, render out, make sure you get your render timeline set up. Do the 1-star pass to check for a lot of the basics in the animation, how it's actually coming all together. Get your lighting set up with these keyframes. And a couple little miscellaneous things I'm going to add in here. Something that I've learned with Lumion, and the developers are well aware, if you've had Lumion open for a long time, it seems to like to just eat RAM in the background. I'd recommend opening Task Manager and take a look at your computer settings. I happen to use MSI Afterburner to check my RAM usage and how everything's going. I'm fine, but sometimes as Lumion starts to slowly eat RAM, it starts to run slower if it hasn't been restarted in a while. And I have definitely experienced this where I will do a render test in here to get and it'll say 8 hours, and then I'll just shut off Lumion, maybe even the whole computer, restarted, got everything up, and I saved, a couple hours re-rendering. That might be the case, especially on heavy projects. If you have time to close out your project and reopen it, it's definitely something worth doing just to be safe, because oftentimes Lumion can just get a little bloated, open too long, and it needs to be reset. A whole computer reset I haven't found too necessary anymore, unless you have a billion other applications open. If you just shut Lumion down and reopen it again, it seems to do pretty well. So that's something to play with. Yeah, I think that about covers it. So definitely pretty passionate about this because, and I wish I followed all these steps all the time. I definitely don't. But putting this tutorial together, these are all things that I know really help. And maybe you only realistically have time or patience to do one of these steps, but definitely make sure your render is going to finish in time and have an idea of what you can cut to make it work if you have to. And do the 1-star pass. I really emphasize that. The keyframing, that's icing on the cake. Make sure your lighting is kind of correct. And if you have time to restart or not, things to play with, and save. Definitely save. I know that these things can definitely help you guys out, and I really hope they save you guys on a big animation that you're about to render and you're just nervous, because it's happened to all of us, I'm sure. You wake up in the morning and, dang, forgot to turn something on, or, oh, that's embarrassing. That person just walked in front of a truck. I had that happen on a safety animation, actually. So, yeah, feel free to leave any comments and questions. Love to respond and hear you guys' take on some of these things and some of your ideas or any questions you may have. And thanks for watching. Many more tutorials to come. Subscribe for more content like this. And thanks for watching. Until next time, guys.